Hi, everyone, and welcome to tonight's program, Blood is Thicker Than Water. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, this afternoon, this morning, whatever time of day it is where you are. My name is Erin Aoyama. I am a doctoral candidate in American Studies at Brown University, and I am the Community Outreach and Programs Fellow at Minidoka National Historic Site. And I'm delighted to serve as the moderator for our conversation today. Over the course of the next hour, we will hear from two wonderful speakers, Dr. Charlene Drew Jarvis and David Kilton. Both will share stories from their families that speak to the impact that segregation and racism had on and within the United States during World War II, and about some of the legacies from this period. As we approach the 80th anniversary of the United States' entry into World War II, it's important and meaningful for us to reckon with some of the stories that challenge, perhaps, our understanding of the history of this period. How can grappling with the realities of segregation and racism, which shaped all facets of life for Americans during World War II, even as the United States fought for democracy and freedom abroad, help us understand our present? Why are these stories important to continue unearthing and sharing? As we hear from Dr. Jarvis and David, I invite all of us to think too about the theme for this year's commemoration of the attack on Pearl Harbor: valor, sacrifice, and peace. Our session on Monday, which some of you may have joined in for, focused largely on valor and sacrifice on the battlefield. This evening, we'll hear stories about valor and sacrifice beyond and outside of the battlefield, and we'll reflect together on how these two deeply meaningful and complex characteristics might light a path towards peace and justice in our future. So with that, I am thrilled to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Charlene Drew Jarvis. In her long and distinguished career, Dr. Charlene Drew Jarvis has held positions as a neuroscientist, a legislator, and university president. She received a BS from Oberlin College, an MS from Howard University, and a PhD in neuropsychology from the University of Maryland, all the while balancing the demands of a wife and mother of two young, active sons. Dr. Jarvis's educational background led to a career as a neuroscientist at the National Institute of Mental Health in Bethesda, Maryland. Responding to the need to help rebuild the economy of Washington, D.C. in the aftermath of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, Dr. Jarvis ran for public office and was elected to the Council of the District of Columbia 6 times. Her work as chair of the Committee on Economic Development, a position she held for more than 20 years, was both pioneering and impactful. Dr. Jarvis's legacy as the daughter of Dr. Charles R. Drew, the blood bank pioneer, has given her a special perspective as an advocate for science and health education. In her association with the American Red Cross, Dr. Jarvis has traveled to Red Cross and bone marrow sites around the nation to speak about her father's life and work and to encourage the participation of minority blood and marrow donors, which I think we'll talk more about tonight. Today, Dr. Jarvis describes herself as, quote, working retired, and serves on a number of boards and advisory councils, in addition to continuing to speak about her own work alongside her father's work and legacy. Dr. Jarvis, I know you told me to keep my introduction of you short and brief, but there was so much to cover, and I wanted to make sure we could touch on all of these fascinating parts of your life. But thank you so much for being here this evening. As a quick reminder to our audience, we will have time for Q&A at the end, so please leave your comments and questions in the chat. And with that, I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Erin. I'm delighted to join you and David and all from the Pacific Historic Parks and the Pearl Harbor National Memorial there in Hawaii. It's a great pleasure to be joining you and many of the people who are watching from the wonderful state of Hawaii. And I thank you for focusing on the stories of World War II. My father is called the father of the blood bank, and you announced a title of Blood is Thicker Than Water. He was called the father of the blood bank because it was his work that very painstakingly discovered how to preserve blood and how to preserve plasma. Those were very important, life-saving, technical accomplishments, which was very important in World War II. Of course, whole red blood cannot be transfused on the battlefield. It requires refrigeration. We were at war, and our soldiers were in need of blood. what Dr. Drew did with his work is to discover that plasma, the yellow substance which is a part of the blood, can be dried and it can be reconstituted on the battlefield. That was a tremendous contribution to saving lives on the battlefield, because plasma does not require refrigeration. Plasma does not require blood typing. So it was not necessary to match donor and recipient. And for that reason, his work was really critically important in World War II. Paradoxically, it was the Surgeons General of the Army and the Navy who made a decision early on that the blood of African Americans and white Americans should be separated. And it was the policy of the Red Cross as a result. And the Red Cross segregated the blood of African Americans and white Americans. My father, as a scientist, indicated that there was no reason to segregate blood, this term blood is thicker than water was really the same for all of us. Blood is the same, irrespective of what are constructs of race. But he had a hard time really convincing not only the medical personnel in the Army and the Navy and the Red Cross, but we were a society then that believed that separation was necessary. He along with many other people, actually in the War Department and within the larger community, fought against that segregation of the blood. He himself initially could not have been a donor of blood. And that policy, in fact, was not changed to very late. But we have some words that Tom Guglielmo identified of a soldier who said he didn't care what the color of blood was. He just wanted to have the life-saving properties of blood. And that was my father's life work. He went to Amherst College and he followed that with an MD degree from McGill University in Canada. He then, after a residency in Canada, he then went to Columbia Presbyterian Hospital in New York, which is where he did his basic research on the storage and preservation of blood. And it was there that he earned the Doctor of Science degree in surgery. Dr. Drew was quite a student, and he had not only an interest in blood, he had an interest in shock. And of course, during the war, shock was a principal issue that the men and their leaders had to contend with. When Dr. Drew took his surgery boards, he talked about shock, and he was such a student of shock that the people who were questioning him stopped and went along the hall and gathered other people to say, come and listen, you must listen to Dr. Drew talk about shock. So the work which he did in shock and the work which he did in the storage and preservation of blood was really a critical part of World War II, because understanding both how you store and preserve blood in the form of plasma and how you address shock when you find it on the battlefield was something that was really critically important. Dr. Drew was named the head of the Blood for Britain project by the Blood Transfusion Society in New York. And it was his responsibility to make sure that plasma and blood that could in fact be refrigerated overseas was being sent in quantities that were sufficient for the soldiers who were in need of those, both the whole red blood if they were in the hospitals or plasma if they were on the battlefield. So that was extraordinarily important work that was done in a very short period of time. And really very shortly after he had finished the research which he did in the laboratory of Dr. John Scudder at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital. So the need for the work which he did was immediate in terms of World War II and the delivery of care. Dr. Drew, once the blood transfusion project was over, went to Howard University, where he had been at the end of his McGill training and to get of his Columbia training. He had gone to Howard for a while, where he was the head of the Department of Surgery, but he was called to serve in World War II. He was called to serve to make sure that there was plasma and whole red blood in World War II, and then he returned to Howard University. And you're looking at a picture of Dr. Drew and his residence at Howard University. He felt not only was the work which he did on banking important, but he felt the training of African-American surgeons was extremely important. And when his residents went to take their national surgery boards, the president of Howard University came to our home, and he said to Dr. Drew that his students, his residents, had placed second and first on those national surgery boards. His mantra was, excellence of performance will overcome any artificial barriers created by man. He thought that to be true for himself. He thought it to be true for his residents and for those he worked with. He thought it to be true for his children. And it is a mantra that we have ourselves taken very seriously all of our lives. Dr. Drew and my mom were married in a period of 4 months. He spied her at a party given in Atlanta. That's Bibi at the top. Bibi is the first daughter. She was named for a blood bank by the nurses in Columbia Presbyterian Hospital because my mother and father had not named her. I am named Charlene for my father and my mother because my father was Charles and my mother was Lenore. Sylvia in the pink was named for the mother of Romulus and Remus by my father, who was really a student of Greek and Roman history, and my brother Charles R. Drew Jr. So we had a wonderful family after a very fast courtship with my mother, who herself had earned 2 master's degrees and probably was one of the first independent women around that I knew. And he came to Washington, D.C., back to Howard University, and we had the good fortune of growing up on a college campus. That meant we could enjoy much offered there at the campus. We could take fencing and violin and piano lessons. We could annoy the plebes when they walked around the campus, and we could learn from him at the hospital. Dr. Drew died very tragically in an automobile accident at the age of 45. He was almost 46 years old. And there is a myth surrounding his death, which says that he was denied plasma or a blood transfusion that might have saved his life. That myth arose, we learned, because there had been another African American on the same highway who did lose his life and was turned away from Duke University Hospital because in the South there was a segregation of healthcare delivery. African American patients had beds that were designated for them, and the young man whose life was taken as a result of not having a bed for an African American died on his way to another hospital. My dad was grievously wounded, and I always like to disabuse people of the notion that he was not treated, because he was in fact treated, and he would not like for the myth of his death to in any way inhibit people's willingness to give blood, because he was a lifesaver.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jarvis, for sharing some of those stories, and especially hearing the stories behind your name and the names of your siblings is so fun. And the fact that your older sister's named BB after blood bank is a wonderful tribute to so much of your father's work and both of your parents. So we will hear from you again, and hopefully have some wonderful conversation and questions from the audience. But I'm going to turn things over now to David Kilton, who some of you may have seen on Monday or watched speak a little bit on Monday. I will introduce him very briefly again, and David will also share some stories about his own family to help us think about this time period as well. So David Kilton is the Interpretation and Visitor Services Lead at Pearl Harbor National Memorial. David has worked for the National Park Service for over 14 years. He first dreamed of working for the NPS because of his love of the outdoors, but has since also found joy in fueling his passion for learning, serving others, and sharing history. Most recently, David worked at Little Rock Central High School National Historic Park in Arkansas. David is honored to work for the National Park Service to promote the agency's mission in preserving and sharing the various legacies, stories of transformative individuals, and iconic natural scenes that make up the United States for present and future generations. So, David, thank you so much for joining us again today, and I will turn the floor over to you.
Erin, thank you so much. And Dr. Jarvis, thank you so much for sharing your story. As Erin mentioned, one of the reasons I wanted to be a part of this is because there's aspects of what Dr. Jarvis shared that really deeply touched my life through my grandfather and his service in World War II. Before I tell that story, though, I want to highlight some of the sacrifice and efforts that were made specifically in World War II because of the side work at Pearl Harbor National Memorial, and as we are commemorating our 80th anniversary, as we continue on through the war, there was a lot of sacrifices made by individuals that cue right into that segregation and bias that was shown through the story of separation of blood, and to highlight some of those different groups, because it ties directly into my grandfather's story. I'll talk for a minute about some of the stories that would tie right into where we are today in Hawaii, and that is the story of the 422nd Regimental Combat Unit, which was a unit that was made mostly of, actually 2/3 of it were Hawaiian native Nisei or second generation Japanese Americans. They are one of the most decorated units still today because of just their tenacity, their valor, their courage and bravery, and just dedicated service in the war. And I think one of the aspects of their story that is so profound is they, along with the other mainland-based other third that would have made up that unit, were descendants and individuals that had basically suffered the trauma of being incarcerated in the incarceration camps throughout the country due to what fear and just bias and things that grew from the nation and the laws that were enacted because of Japanese fear of what might happen of also spies and other things like that. And so these individuals that had been incarcerated also were upset because of the attacks on our nation. And then they went and were eventually able to serve in the military. And when they go into the military, they develop a motto, go for broke. And they just served with their whole heart and being. And as I mentioned, become one of the most decorated units. So we have that unit. We also have units like the Tuskegee Airmen. And We have the Navajo Code Talkers, all these different groups of individuals that serve in the military in segregated situations because they would not have desegregated the military until Executive Order 9,981 was passed in the Truman administration in 1948, so after World War II. So these segregated units that go and fight and sacrifice for their country, and also have their own struggles and problems back home within the United States that they had to overcome as well. And those efforts would, I just really think are so impactful that when they were not maybe fully accepted or might have consequences of the racism and bias that they had to struggle through, but they still rose to the call. And before I tell my grandfather's story for just a minute, I want to kind of highlight that these units, as well as my grandfather and others at this time, those that were here at Pearl Harbor, those that died, those that survived, and those that rose to the challenge, that we call that generation the greatest generation. And I don't think everything that was decided during those times was necessarily great. But I think one of the aspects that you could call great is they rose to the challenge over and over. These individuals faced the Great Depression, they faced World War II, and then they also almost immediately go into struggling with the understanding and coming to grips with the continued bias and racism, and go into the civil rights movement. And they lived through all of this. And this is why my grandfather's story really stands out to me. And that is because he was born in Bessemer, Alabama, right near Birmingham. That's actually where I was born as well. And was raised in that racist, segregated, biased society and culture that was there and had been there for generations. So being raised in that, he definitely had a way that he thought of himself, of things, and then had some of that bias within himself. Then he goes into World War II, and as he fought in the war, he was actually at D-Day and was part of storming the beaches there. And he also continued on and was a troop transport driver on the European in the European theater. But as he was in the war, he came to see and interact with some of these different units and these individuals that he had been taught to think less of, to maybe even hate and fear and had been separated from because of the way he had been raised. But he saw different things as he fought in the war and went to these different battlefronts. He saw that those individuals that he had been taught to fear and hate and have this bias, that they were willing to sacrifice and lay down their lives, and they were dedicated. And he really started to reevaluate some of the things that he had been taught from the moment he was born, and the culture and society he had been brought up in. And because of his confronting and seeing those things, he eventually decided to try to turn away from that way that he had raised. Now, I'm not going to say he didn't have bias when he died or things like that, but he made efforts to change the way he would live. And Joy, if you can show a picture of my grandfather in his uniform there, but the way he lived his life, turning away from some of those things, and then eventually raised his children, and they raised their children, definitely had an impact. And I think that story really highlighted some of the reasons that I feel the way I do today. And I eventually worked at Little Rock Central High School because that story of change and how one individual can make a difference whether it's in the decisions they make in their own life or whether they're willing to sacrifice and make a difference in the lives of others. And I think that's definitely the story of Dr. Jarvis. It was definitely the story of the Little Rock Nine and their families that made that sacrifice to step in and rise to a challenge as they strove to desegregate and bring forward steps in desegregating education, and other stories that would go on into the decades to come. And so another thing I wanted to share about his story is his story. I saw a mirroring of that story as I worked at Central High School National Historic Site. And that story would happen in 1957. So just about a decade after the end of the war. And in that story, if you recall or you're not familiar, the National Guard was called in to help with the desegregation there. And at first they were called in to prevent the Little Rock Nine from going into the school. And then within about a month, they actually were called back in as federalized troops under now the orders of President Eisenhower, along with members of the 101st Airborne. And they came back in this time to protect the Little Rock Nine as they eventually, through the court cases, were allowed to enter the school. And I actually had the opportunity to talk with one of the survivors of the National Guard. And he told his story about how he had to come to grips, also being raised in that segregated, biased society in Arkansas, with both times doing his job. He first comes out and he has to maybe defend the way he had grown up and protect that segregation. And that was what he was called to do. And while he's working in that capacity, following orders, doing his job, he sees the treatment, the threats that are made on the Little Rock Nine, who are just teenage high school students, and really comes to value, whoa, that's not a good thing. Well, then eventually he comes back as, before I mention the next part, him and the other National Guardsmen were actually, by the segregationists that were there protesting the Little Rock Nine going to school, were actually called heroes. And people yelled out how proud they were of them and honoring them for coming in and doing that job of preventing the Nine from going to school. Well, we flip back in a month when they come back. Now under President Eisenhower's orders, he's protecting those Little Rock Nine. And he and his fellow National Guardsmen had duties of walking the perimeter of the school. And they had eggs thrown at them, and they were called traitors, and they were yelled at. But he saw those students having the right to go and have the education that had been granted to them by our federal government, that he was doing right by them. And he said in a month's time, he had to come to grips with maybe the way he was raised wasn't right. And so I think ultimately telling those stories, my grandfather and Mr. Knight was actually the name of the National Guardsman. It really, we have those moments where we might step in and have maybe decisions, things that we see placed in front of us, and we can decide to make the change for the good or for the bad. And sometimes we may not know what that is at the moment, but if we are brave enough to step into that place and do what is right, as Dr. Jarvis does, we can make a difference in the lives of so many. And then just one person can be the person that makes that difference. And that's why I wanted to join today, and the stories I wanted to share for sure.
Thank you so much, David. That was really exciting and interesting to hear about. And I'm so happy that you mentioned the 442nd, that segregated all Japanese American unit. My grandfather served in the 442nd, and it's something that I grew up being very proud of. It was one of the very few things that I knew about my grandparents, because neither of them talked very much about their experience during World War II. My grandmother was incarcerated at a camp in Wyoming. And so I think growing up, it's thinking about how do we carry this pride in our ancestors, the way that you've talked about, and the way that those kind of stories have these complexities and these nuances, but these lessons also to carry with us. But how do we hear those stories when, you know, the folks who live through them sometimes don't want to talk about it or didn't share about it? And one of the things that's, you know, been meaningful for me about my grandfather is that there's ways to learn about his life through military records and, you know, through documentaries and books and all of these things. But it's harder with folks like my grandmother who didn't talk about them. So anyway, just you've given me a lot to think about as far as pride and ancestors and sharing these stories. So thank you so much. I'm going to ask Dr. Jarvis to return to us on screen. Hi, Dr. Jarvis.
Hi there.
And thank you both so much again for sharing these stories from your own lives and from your families. We have a couple of questions from the audience, but I know we had some really fun conversation the other day as well. So I also wanted to give both of you the chance to respond or ask questions of the other if there's anything you'd like to start with before we turn it over to audience questions as well.
Well, you know, David, I thought you said some really, really important things. One of the things that you said was that your grandfather found that when he actually got to know African Americans and to see them in action and to see them as human beings who were like all the rest of the human beings, they fought, they bled, they cried, you know, they had families, and he learned a lesson from that. And I think that's a lesson for all of us, which is if we are going to live together, then we should live together. And the separation is what created a lot of the myths about each group, about Japanese Americans, about African Americans, about white Americans from the perspective of people who were part of minority groups. So the lesson that I got from that is that it really is critically important for us to know one another and to put aside the myths and the prejudices and really view one another in light of our own experiences, our family, our histories, our connection to our communities. So that was a very, very important thing that your grandfather shared, and that your father apparently, and that was that your dad's father?
It was my mother's father.
That was your mother's father. So that your mother had those kinds of lessons, which then certainly got imparted to you. And that's really the name of this story, isn't it?
It is. It is, for sure. Thank you. And I think one of the things that really stands out to me, and I know as we were preparing for this, is just bringing out the stories of, you would think that the saving of lives, like there wouldn't be that segregation and separation, but it highlights how embedded those biases and racisms were and can be. And taking a moment to evaluate where we stand and looking, I think sometimes we're quick to put barriers and find ways to separate ourselves. But when we really try to evaluate those separations and those barriers, we can see there's a lot more similarities than differences, and a lot more reason to reach out and engage, even if we don't always agree, and grow from learning from one another and from the beauty of those differences than trying to put up those barriers and ingrain those things that separate, that can, again, even prevent us from having the tools and the resources to save lives. And just, it's incredible that it was that way. And hopefully we can turn away from that and learn from those mistakes and those errors in judgment that have happened in the past.
And I do like to say to folks that we lived parallel lives. We lived parallel lives, but not deficient lives. We were in communities. We worshiped in similar ways. We had family gatherings in similar ways. We valued education in similar ways. So, it is those things of commonality between our groups that really have the opportunity to bring us together or to appreciate the differences, but they're all a part of the human story.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. And another thing that kind of stands out to me too is that there's opportunities to break from that. And I think your story definitely, Dr. Jarvis's story really says that, and your continuing of his legacy, but also like how with my children, my oldest daughter went to Central High School for all 4 years, graduated just last year, and she actually helped to tell that story. And her understanding, she's teaching me today of how I can like still look to evaluate and understand where maybe some of my blind spots are today and things like that, and how that daily reevaluation of where we are it is important, and it's a good thing to do. And some people might say that if we think about what we honor every day here at Pearl Harbor is the memorial of those that lost their lives, that bringing out those stories of maybe the dark spots in the history of World War II and of the greatest generation and things like that is diminishing the memory of those that sacrificed and died on that day. And I think it adds to them, actually. And I brought this out the other day too, is the more we understand all the parallel stories, and we've already been talking about the way we can connect our stories and the similarities, the more value it brings into those sacrifices and the things that happened in the reality, because life doesn't happen in a bubble, and there's so many ways that we really connect.
I'm enjoying just listening to you, to both of you. Sorry, Dr. Jarvis.
And this is one of them. Think about your history, Aaron. Think about your grandfather's history, David. Think about my dad and my family's history. This is one of the ways in which we celebrate the history, the differences, and the similarities. And I think it's a great opportunity that you've brought us together to do this. David, thank you, and Hanukkah, and David, and Joy for doing this, and Aaron for the history that you just shared. Because the treatment of Japanese Americans during the Second World War is something we don't like to think about. The segregation of blood is something we don't like to think about. The treatment of African Americans during the war and after is something we don't like to think about, but we need to think about it and put it past us and decide that we are going to live life in a way that brings us together.
And I appreciate so much from both of you the way that these stories have both moments of real pain in some ways, and then these moments of joy and resilience and, families going on. And there's something powerful, I think, about putting these things together, because that's how we all experience life, and that's how we can experience history. And I believe very strongly that that's a path towards peace and towards justice, is a lot of this sort of sitting together and intergenerational storytelling, cross-community storytelling, sometimes about things that don't make sense or that don't fit up next to each other very easily or well. And I'm thinking about what you were saying, David, that we talked about the other day, that, after Pearl Harbor, there were so many men in need of blood, in need of care, and the way that decisions were made that were not in the service of saving lives. And how do we make sense of that when we had, all of these pieces that are important to bring together and just sort of let them be there so that we can hopefully learn something moving forward. We have a couple questions from the chat, and I have some questions for both of you, so we'll turn to those now. Hanako Wakatsuki, who's watching from the audience, asks, Dr. Jarvis, can you talk a little bit more about how your father's work shaped who you are? Which I know you mentioned, some points about, but maybe sharing some of your own work and the ways that, your father's legacy was present in so many of those, and the way you've lived your life.
Thanks for that question, Hanukkah. My father was a taskmaster, and he had high expectations of his residents and his children. As I said, he had a mantra: excellence of performance will overcome any artificial barriers created by men. And so his residents did extraordinarily well, and I carried that with me as well. And I think I've been driven actually by my father's demand for achievement and excellence. And so I started out actually in research. I did basic research on the brain at the National Institutes of Mental Health for about 8 years or so, and I was fascinated by the brain. I still am fascinated by the brain, but I got attracted to public service because it was after the riots following the assassination of Dr. King. Washington, D.C.'s neighborhood commercial corridors were devastated by the riots, and it was 10 years after, and it didn't seem that there was evidence of rebuilding. And so I actually decided to leave science and to seek elected office, and I was fortunate to become the chair of the Economic Development Committee of the Council of the District of Columbia, and in that role, it was my goal and my drive to really help rebuild our neighborhood commercial corridors, to get banks to overcome the redlining, to build more housing in communities that were in need, to build an economic base for the city, convention center, and that kind of edifice that could return some revenue to the city. And I spent a long time there, honestly, at the time when people were moving out of the city and businesses were moving out of the city, and my goal was to get them back and really rebuild the city. I discovered that a lot of small businesses really didn't have the technical skills, the management skills, human resources skills to do and rebuild. And so I went to a university founded by the YMCA in 1879 that started out as an accounting school. And my goal there was to help people understand entrepreneurship, building businesses, being creative and having self-sufficiency. And those were the goals that I had when I left there, and I'm, still doing those kinds of things, caring for the community. I'm on something called the Washington Housing Conservancy, which is designed for investors to acquire housing and keep people from being displaced from the cities now that we have a turnover. So I continue to do those things that I think are connected to the success of people in their lives. That's really been my goal.
That's wonderful. And Dr. Jarvis, if we could stay with you for a minute, and then David, I have some questions for you too. But another question from an audience member, from Joy, asks how, and you talked about this also a little bit, but maybe we can get into some more details. How was your father's medical training, life, and education impacted by racism or segregation? And how do you see the legacies of that experience still reflected in medical systems today? And you mentioned this sort of mythology around your father's tragic death, and that he did in fact receive good health care, but his injuries were just too much for him to recover from. But I think you touched on an important point at the time, but that we also see today with medical care. And I'm thinking about, statistics around Black mothers and mortality rates, and even, COVID and COVID-19, especially in the beginning before vaccines, the communities that were most impacted. So I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about both your father's life and experiences, and what you see, what, the work that you've done, and what you hope for the future as far as really bringing more equity, I think, to medical systems more generally.
Well, there's been a segregated healthcare system, healthcare delivery system for many, many years in this country, and there still is. There still is not the equity in our communities of color. Part of that problem is that healthcare is so expensive that many in our communities don't seek it when they need to, and when they seek it, they are far beyond a position of health. And my father understood that segregated system, and his intention was to produce physicians that were the very best physicians in the country, but his intention was for them to serve the African American community, because that's where the dearth of physicians was. My father went to McGill Medical School because the medical schools in this country, by and large, did not admit African Americans. And he went to McGill and he found a very open society there, and he was very successful, and he was very lucky, my dad was, that his vigor and his intention was supported by many people as he moved along in his career. But his intention was to figure out how to produce the best physicians in the African American community and help close the gap between the healthcare delivery system in this country. We are still fighting that problem. And there are still too few African American physicians. And one thing that is good to remember, not something that you might be aware of, is that the American Medical Association would not permit African Americans who were trained in medicine to have staff privileges at hospitals that were serving white Americans. That really undercut the development of African American physicians in this country for many years. And I remember seeing a 1947 letter from my father to the head of the AMA, who said, "This is ridiculous. You need the physicians in these communities where you don't want our physicians to serve." And it actually was not until 2008 that the American Medical Association apologized for what its history had done in essentially undercutting the development of African American doctors. There is in Los Angeles a 1,200 doctor problem there in terms of serving the community. So there are folks now at Howard University who have the same intention now that they had before, to turn out great numbers of African American physicians, because those are the physicians who go to those communities. And the problem is that a lot of physicians do not now anymore take Medicare and Medicaid, but African American physicians do in those communities. So my hope is that we can continue to close that gap. And my sister Sylvia is now and a special assistant. She's a lawyer, but she's a special assistant to the president at the Charles Drew Medical School, and they are turning out students of very diverse backgrounds there in order to take their place in the very important communities of our country. So I have hope.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think I didn't know that history around the American Medical Association. And I think just hearing some of those stories is so important to understand the systemic roots of a lot of this, that it's not just that, there weren't enough folks who wanted to be doctors who weren't white, but that there were actually these sort of systemic structural things put in place that prevented and made this disparity even worse. So thank you for sharing that and for sharing your hope as well. David, I have a question for you that was actually emailed in by someone who doesn't have a YouTube account, and it's moving, focus a little bit, but I think not completely, and ties back to some of what you were talking about before with the stories that you tell about Pearl Harbor. So this person asks, Pearl Harbor is the catalyst for the U.S. entering World War II in so many ways. So what is your vision for telling a more complete story at the site? And I will remind you that you are muted before you begin.
So it's a great question. And being 4 months in the job, definitely something that's already been hugely on my mind. And to illustrate that, the point of one of the things that is my focus is I feel we have a lot of stories that I already alluded to that parallel and tie in and connect with this story that I feel in a lot of ways haven't been shown. And to highlight what I hope to do, I'm going to switch back to my last site a little bit for just a moment. So Little Rock Central High School National Historic Site. Again, you've got the Little Rock Nine, you've got the National Guard, you've got the 101st Airborne, you've got Governor Faubus, who is the kind of the focus for the negative end of things, and definitely became the focus of the blame when kind of everything came out of how much of a black eye that story left on our country and on the society and things like that, which in a lot of ways was revealing the truth of what the situation was. Well, one of the things that we did was we welcomed all the stories. We tried to bring in all the stories, those that would have been on the side of the segregationists, as well as those that were supportive and part of the steps to bring about that change, because all those stories are part of the picture. And we worked with youth groups, and I mentioned my daughter earlier. She was part of a group called the Memory Project that actually helped to highlight those stories. They actually did a project during her time there where they actually took on the persona of some of the individuals, researched firsthand accounts and quotes, and actually dressed up. And we did an evening kind of lantern lit program where they actually shared those stories, basically based all on the story coming straight from those individuals, taking on both the roles of the players that were maybe on the justice side of things, as well as those that were trying to prevent for that change and those positive movements to make us really have the equality and that we needed to have. So tying in with the community through and the Memory Project, the way that they found a lot of their stories is they would go out into the community and they would branch out and they would find other individuals that had connections to that history and share how their lives were impacted by those stories, and bring those stories back so that we could share the broader picture. And that's one of the things I really hope to do here is, as was mentioned in the question itself, this was the catalyst of our country entering World War II. Hawaii wasn't even a state. It was actually annexed because of the value of a military base here, but also the places where they could have these crops of sugar and coffee and other things and raised, and pineapple and those things. So it was a legacy of the colonialism spreading out, reaching for resources at the expense of others. Well, if you add on to that story that as Hawaii was annexed, and then eventually war was brought to this same culture and community, the natives that lived here. And they were some of the individuals that jumped in to help and put the Navy back on its feet and salvage, were these same individuals that had basically had their life, their culture, their land taken from them. And that's a legacy of multiple different stories. But those stories also are impactful, and they're part of the legacy and the honor that we need to give to those that sacrificed and gave their lives, including some of those same Native Hawaiians that lost their lives in it. So broadening and reaching out, and maybe having the kids, students, help us to engage the stories of their great aunts and their grandmothers and their uncles or whoever that were part of this story, because we are going to lose those stories if we don't capture them now. And capturing those stories, helping to give that opportunity to really show respect and bring the memorial, bringing the memory of all those that were impacted by these events, not just on December 7th, 1941, but in the days and years to come, and are still being impacted today.
And I'm really excited to see David check back in with you in another 4 months. But I think you make a beautiful point that it's no less honoring those who, lost their lives or sacrificed so much, to also tell some of the other stories that are, less positive, to, completely not use the right word there, but that came out of this. And I think of, the families that were rounded up and separated and incarcerated and removed from their homes, partly as a result of Pearl Harbor, but also stemming from years of anti-Asian racism and prejudice. Those stories have to be told alongside the bravery of, the men who served, the men who were there, have to be told alongside the story of Dr. Drew, who was creating life-saving techniques and still seeing this injustice of blood being segregated and, having Black donors turned away from donating blood at first. So all of these stories do need to be pulled together. And I'm grateful to have been part of this conversation, because I think there's so much to learn from hearing what both of you have had to say. And as we are fast approaching the end of our hour, I just want to also give both of you the opportunity to offer some words. I know we've done this, but to offer some words for today, for the future, any hopes or thoughts or reflections, especially as we move towards the 80th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor. So Dr. Jarvis, I will hand it to you first. Any last thoughts or takeaways that you'd like to leave us with today?
Well, Aaron, I think the very fact that you and David and I can tell different stories means that we have to listen to one another. It does mean that everybody has a story that will make all of us understand the ways in which we grew up that were different, the ways in which they were similar, and the fact that we're in the middle of kind of a revisionist history in our lives. In other words, this history is a little bit different than it has been in the past, because there seems to be a greater willingness now to examine our past practices and to broaden our thinking. It has led to a lot of retraction of people who don't want to have those conversations, but it has led to many more people who wish to have those conversations and want to know about your grandfather, David, and want to know, Aaron, about your family and the Japanese incarceration, and are anxious to know that it was actually someone who figured out about the storage and preservation of blood who was African American. And I think there is a readiness in this country to have those conversations. And this is exactly the kind of thing I think that is helpful in that regard.
Thank you, Dr. Jarvis. And David.
Dr. Jarvis, it's been an honor, a pleasure. Aaron, and Joy, and Hanako, I really am excited to have been a part of this and to share some of my reflection on the stories that have impacted my life. And I think that's one of the reasons I love my job so much, is we get to share these stories every day, and they can make a difference. And what we learn today can make a difference tonight. It can make a difference tomorrow. And the more we're willing to reach out and embrace that, I think the better we'll be. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to have had individuals that have helped me to know that pulling back that curtain, even if it's a hard thing to look at when you pull back and reveal what has happened, has benefit just in that.
Sure.
Because ultimately, I mean, what we memorialize here every day is war. It's not pretty. It's terrible and tragic. And the elements of what happened on that day and in the years to come, that we will continue to honor the 80th anniversary of events that happened in World War II. And I said honor, but commemorate. This is what I meant to say, is commemorate those moments in history that are coming up. There'll be other stories that were tragic and awful. There'll be also those stories of bravery, and seeing all those stories brings value and brings learning and brings opportunities for us to grow. And so it's been a pleasure and honor to do that with all of you today. And so thank you.
Thank you so much, David and Dr. Jarvis. Thank you, folks, for your questions and comments and for tuning in. A big thank you to Joy Yamaguchi, who is running things behind the scenes here, to Weston Saito, Hanako Akatsuki, David for putting these programs together. There's one more live program on Friday evening at the same time, if it's afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. So please tune in for that. And thank you all so much, folks, for being here with us, and wishing you the best for the rest of your week.
Thank you so much, Erin, and thank you again, Joy and Hanako and David for this, and Erin for your excellence in moderating.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, folks.
Bye-bye.